Flanders, 1915. You are a British sniper. Your crosshairs are resting dead center on a German officer's chest at 200 yards. You pull the trigger. The bullet does not hit the officer. It impacts 2 feet to his right. A split second later, a German counter-sniper puts a 7.92 millimeter round through your skull. You did not miss because you were a bad shot. You died because the geometry was wrong. And the British Army had known about the geometry for months. The standard British infantry weapon was the short-magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III. It was built around a single doctrine, volume of fire. The SMLE held 10 rounds, its rear locking bolt cocked on the closing stroke, positioned directly above the trigger. Then the armies dug in. November 1914. The war of movement ended. The battlefield froze into a stagnant network of trenches, and volume of fire meant absolutely nothing. The German army had understood this immediately. They had entered the war with a mature sniping culture, backed by thousands of requisitioned civilian sporting rifles and high-quality optics. The Mauser Gewehr 98 was slower to cycle than the Lee-Enfield. It held only 5 rounds. Its bolt required a rigid 90-degree rotation that broke the shooter's aim. None of that mattered. The Mauser's front-locking lugs meant the bolt head locked directly into the chamber. No microscopic receiver flex, no movement between the steel and the cartridge, manufactured to tight tolerances, superior long-range accuracy, and most importantly, the German scopes were mounted directly over the center line of the bore. When the British realized they were losing approximately 5 men per battalion every single day to German marksmen, the War Office panicked. Sir John Cowans, the Quartermaster General responsible for equipping the British Expeditionary Force, faced a simple demand from the front: put optics on the rifles. He responded the only way his institution allowed. He requisitioned scopes. He issued them to frontline units. And he sent them forward without a calibration range, without a training doctrine, and without a single written instruction on how the geometry worked. A soldier was given a rifle with a piece of glass bolted to the side and told to go kill Germans. The SMLE was never designed to accept a scope. The rifle loaded from the top, using 5-round charger clips, brass casings ejected straight up. Mount a scope directly over the receiver, and you block the action entirely. The weapon cannot load. It jams on the first ejected casing. So the British solution was to mount the scope entirely on the left side of the wooden stock, offset from the barrel by several inches. On a static range, with a known distance, an offset scope can be made to work. The line of sight and the bullet's trajectory will cross at one specific point, an invisible X in the air. Zero the rifle for 100 yards, and it strikes exactly where the crosshairs rest at 100 yards. Combat does not happen at fixed, known distances. At 50 yards, the bullet strikes drastically to the right. At 200 yards, it drifts wildly to the left. The British sniper was calculating a complex lateral holdover under fire in freezing mud through a 2-power lens that fogged at the first change in temperature. That was the second problem. The first was worse. By 1915, firing over the top of the parapet was a death sentence. Snipers on both sides operated from concealed positions built into the trench wall, firing through small apertures cut into heavy steel armor plates. Loopholes, just large enough to see through, just large enough to accommodate a rifle barrel. When a German sniper positioned his Mauser behind a steel plate, his center-mounted scope aligned perfectly with his barrel. He looked through the hole. The bullet went through the hole. When a British sniper attempted the same, the lateral offset of his scope created a fatal discrepancy. If he aligned the scope with the loophole, his muzzle was pointing directly at the solid steel interior of his own cover. If he pulled the trigger, the high-velocity 303 round would shatter against the back of the steel plate, inches from his face. Hot spalling, lead fragments, directly into his own eyes and throat. To avoid killing himself, the British sniper was forced to abandon the loophole entirely and expose his upper body over the parapet, silhouetted against the skyline. For the waiting German marksman, the steel plate built to protect him had become the mechanism of his death. Cowans had the reports. Frontline officers documented the loophole problem and sent it up the chain. The geometry was not a mystery. It was a choice to keep issuing the same rifle, because admitting the problem meant admitting that the centerpiece of British infantry doctrine was wrong for the war that was actually being fought. So the scoped SMLEs kept moving forward, and the men behind them kept dying. Through his 2-power lens, a British sniper watched a man smoke a cigarette, speak to a comrade, before making the conscious decision to end that specific life. And then he lay in a frozen hide for 10 hours, unable to move, unable to speak, with a weapon that could not reliably send a round where he aimed it. When he returned to the trench, the psychological residue was permanent. The turning point did not come from the generals. It came from Major Hesketh-Prichard, an explorer and big game hunter who arrived at the front in 1915 and spent months watching men die from a problem he understood immediately. Hesketh-Prichard made a decision his rank did not technically authorize. He went around the established channels and pressed his case directly to senior commanders until the British establishment formalized a sniping program on his terms. He established the First Army School of Sniping. He taught men to calibrate optics and manage the geometric offset. He reduced British sniper casualties measurably in the sectors where his graduates operated. But he understood faster than the War Office did that training could not fix a flawed machine. A man could learn to compensate for the offset. He could not learn to use a loophole safely with a scope designed for a different bore axis. Hesketh-Prichard needed a different rifle. What fixed it was the pattern 1914 Enfield. The P14 had been designed before the war as a potential replacement for the SMLE and shelved when the SMLE lobby prevailed. Hesketh-Prichard pushed for its adoption specifically because of its geometry. The P14 abandoned traditional British bolt mechanics entirely and integrated a Mauser-style claw extractor with dual front-locking lugs, heavy barrel, tight tolerances, manufactured by American contractors Winchester and Remington. For an infantryman going over the top, it was a terrible weapon. Those tight tolerances meant the moment the rifle touched Flanders mud, the action choked. In a sniper hide, it was a surgical instrument. The P14's receiver featured a solid bridge over the bolt, optics mounted directly over the center line of the bore. No lateral drift, no offset calculation, no loophole trap. The British sniper could sit behind a steel armor plate, look through the aperture, and send a round exactly where the crosshairs rested. The geometry was finally correct. By the time the P14 reached British snipers in meaningful numbers, the offset scope had been in frontline use for the better part of 2 years. Hesketh-Prichard's school had trained approximately 1,000 snipers by 1918. In sectors where they operated with properly zeroed P14s, the daily casualty rate from German marksmen dropped to a fraction of what it had been in 1915. The front did not become safe, it became even. And even after 2 years of one-sided slaughter, felt like a victory. The fatal geometry of the British sniper was not a technical accident. It was what happens when an institution builds a perfect weapon for one kind of war and then refuses to acknowledge that the war has changed. Sir John Cowans issued rifles. Major Hesketh-Prichard buried men until someone finally listened. The SMLE was correct for 1914. The offset scope was not a solution. It was a compromise, bolted to the side of a doctrine that no longer applied. Every British sniper who died in a loophole was paying the price for that compromise, not with a bad shot, with the geometry